Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Bethanne. Today I am wrapping up my November videos with my final pick for Nonfiction November. I'm filming on December 1st, but I did finish it last night, November 30th, so I snuck it in under the wire. So my fourth pick was for the discovery prompt, and I chose Black Livingstone, A True Tale of Adventure in the 19th Century Congo by Pagan Kennedy. This book was fantastic. Definitely highly recommend it for anyone who wants to learn a bit more about the history of the Congo. Specifically, this is focused mostly on 1890 through 1910, sneaking a little bit before and after that time period. But it's a short volume. It's written beautifully, expressively. It's very easy to just kind of sit down and devour this. It's not a dry history textbook by any means. And part of that is because of the charisma of William Shepherd, who is the focus of this book. So William Shepherd is the man who earned the moniker Black Livingstone, and he was a Black American Presbyterian missionary who was sent to the Congo from 1890 to 1910 to start a Presbyterian mission there. And so the book has, for the discovery prompt, it has just a ton of adventure. When he got there in 1890 with his colleague, his white colleague, Sam Lapsley, the Congo was kind of just the interior of the Congo was kind of just being opened up to exploitation by the Belgians. And so it was really kind of the towns he went through were really frontier towns, and then he disappeared off the map, trekking into the jungle in order to find a place to start the Presbyterian mission. And what's interesting is Joseph Conrad was going in to the Congo about 3 weeks or so behind. I think it was 3 weeks. It was a few weeks behind Shepherd. So that's the period of time. If you've read Heart of Darkness, I assume a lot of people have, the kind of events and atmosphere that are captured in the Heart of Darkness are what's happening in this book, and this is capturing it more from the historical perspective. So Shepherd did, really incredible things in terms of discovery and physical achievement. He would go and hunt and provide food for people. As part of the mission, his job was partly to start an orphanage and a school and kind of care for people. And he was a little bit less into the converting people side of things, side of missionary work once he got over there. The events that really made him famous and earned him the Black Livingstone nickname were he penetrated into a deep central part of the Congo and discovered the Kuba people. So the book paints the Kuba as kind of the last great Central African civilization. Really developed culture, developed society. That would then, in the course of the book, be destroyed by the incoming Belgians. And the Kuba were people who had been totally closed off from Westerners. And Shepherd managed to kind of talk his way in and befriend the king and the royal family. And so he brought back to the US hundreds and hundreds of pieces of beautiful art from these people. And for him, he was bringing them back as proof that Africans were civilized, that there were civilized cultures, that they weren't the inhuman savages that were painted in the media at the time. And so then he went back to the U.S. Several years into his mission, so in the late 1890s, and the Presbyterians trotted him out on a speaking tour as a fundraising tour to raise more funds for the mission. And he apparently was just an astounding orator, very charismatic, a storyteller, and so was able to raise funds and then keep funding the mission until 1910. And this book is really interesting because it weaves not just kind of the facts of his story, but also some of the politics of what was going on with the Belgian conquest of the Congo, and then also some of the race politics in the U.S. and what it must have been like for a Black American to go over to Africa as a missionary. So one thing that was really interesting, for example, was Shepherd was never allowed to be the head of the mission. He always, from the Presbyterian, from the American perspective, he always needed to have a white man who was the boss, which was must have been really frustrating because most of his bosses were kind of incompetent in terms of actually surviving in Africa and doing, the manual labor and the person-to-person labor that Shepherd really excelled at. And so he kind of had to deal with that dynamic. And then as time went on, his white boss in the Presbyterian mission in the Congo, William Morrison, really wanted to expose the Belgian atrocities that were being committed against all of the local peoples. And he basically decided to use Shepherd as like the sacrificial note gatherer who would go gather the evidence, and then Morrison would try to publish it in European newspapers. So at one point, Shepherd is in a remote village where he's established part of the Presbyterian mission, and he gets a letter from Morrison that's like, you need to go into the neighboring region where everybody is getting massacred, and you need to document the massacre for me. And so Shepherd, he is able to get like a few volunteers of local people to go with him. They go into the next region, and there's a fort where another African and his band of warriors have been decimating the local population, kind of a reign of terror to get rubber on behalf of the Belgians. So they're employed by the Belgians. And so Shepherd by himself goes into this fort. And if anybody's familiar with I think kind of the more famous imagery, the idea of a basket full of hands that had been cut off of people who weren't collecting rubber fast enough and that sort of thing. Shepherd is the one who counted that basket of hands, which actually existed. So he was in this fort, and he was worried that he would be killed. And so he basically had to suck up to this war leader who'd been hired by the Belgians. And the war leader, luckily, just kind of assumed that Shepherd was also working for the Belgians and was coming to kind of check on the work. And so the war leader was like proud and like showing him the accomplishment of like they'd accomplished the work. And Shepherd, was nodding and smiling and taking down all these notes, which he then did pass on to Morrison. And that started that and some other things that were going on at the time. Some other people who were starting to talk about the atrocities kickstarted a human rights campaign internationally to try to get the Belgians to stop being so awful in Congo. So that piece is really cool. Not cool, but like good. But then Morrison and some of the other white Presbyterian missionaries on the ground who knew what was going on got kind of increasingly frustrated because they wanted to shove Shepherd out in front of things. He was the storyteller. And Shepherd was like, I am a Black man. Like, I cannot go to the U.S. and start criticizing the U.S. government for failing to take action to stop the Belgians. Like, I'll get lynched. This doesn't make any sense. And, he said it, there's his writing is excerpted in here. He said it much more eloquently and politely than that. But, that was the gist, was he was like, you can't ask a Black man to go back to the U.S. and start criticizing our white government in 1908. Like, that's not gonna fly. So it was just really interesting to just read about some of that tension as well, about how kind of the domestic race politics in America still followed him to Africa and were still constantly something that he had to deal with. So anyway, so all of that was fascinating. I'm talking a lot. I'm going to try to cut this a little short. Now, the other piece I just wanted to mention was this is hard to read as a woman because of just how badly a lot of missionaries' wives were treated. They just had to go along to Africa and create I think part of the problem, they're trying to create American or European civilization in the wilderness, right? Which is really hard. So they were expected to do that, and then they would have babies, and the babies would die. And so Shepherd's wife gets taken over to Africa, and their first two babies die in infancy before 1 year of age because of fevers and disease. And then their second two babies basically spend their early childhood back in the States being raised by William Shepherd's sister, because since Shepherd had to be in Africa being a missionary, therefore so did his wife. And you know, at some point she did agree to marry him, and she knew they actually had a 10-year-long engagement as he got the mission started before she came over there. So in some sense, she did sign up for it, I guess, but it's also just like, I just can't imagine as a 21st century woman, born at the end of the 20th century, like I wouldn't do that. I certainly, yeah, I wouldn't follow my husband into a jungle where my babies would die. And then once I had babies and had acknowledged that their only chance of life was to be in the States, I would leave. But that's a very privileged position to be in, to be able to say that, of course. So those parts were hard to read of what happened to his wife. Once they retired back in the U.S., she actually did get a lot of the things that she wanted, so the family was able to live together, and they were able to have a comfortable kind of middle class life where she got a beautiful house that she always wanted. She was able to bring her mom, who had really sacrificed as a maid for years to try to catapult her daughter into a better life. She was able to bring her mom to live with them so her mom could kind of live in comfort and rest in her final years instead of continuing to work as a maid. So she did get some of the things that were important to her, but not for a very long time. And 2 of their babies died. So that was hard to read. So anyway, yeah, this book was a bit tough to get through, but it is short, it is beautifully written, covers very tough topics, does them very sensitively and well. So definitely highly recommend this. If any of you have read it, I would love to hear more about your thoughts. And if you've read other books about the Congo, we actually have quite a few on our bookshelves that are supposed to be quite good that I would like to get to as well. But I'm definitely open to recommendations because I definitely want to learn more about the history of Africa as a whole. And in particular, I would like to read more about pre-colonial Africa. I know there's a lot less of that than there is about the colonial history of Africa, but I would love to read more of that. So if anybody has any recommendations, please shoot them my way. And with that, thank you for watching this video, and if you like what I'm doing, please hit the subscribe button and leave me a comment, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.